Hello, Scott Young. Thank you so much for joining me on this call. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I want to just give a quick overview. Uh, your background is so extensive. I want to give a quick summary for
Hmm.
folks that may not be familiar with you and your work. And of course, we'll get into more details as we talk. So, Scott Young, and I think of you as Scott H. Young because
Yeah.
I always see the H. But Scott is the author uh, of a Wall Street Journal and a national best-selling book called Ultra Learning: Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate Your Career. And Scott, I will tell you, I love your book. I have been through it probably two and a half times, just reading through it from beginning to end, and I'm continually referencing it. So, massive recommendation on your book. You are a prolific writer. I love your blog. You've been writing it, I think, for about 14, 15 years since '06. You write about learning, you write about productivity, career habits, and just living well and getting better, which are all
Hmm.
things every human should be interested in. So thank you so much for
Oh,
joining.
thank you. Well, it's been a passion of mine for a long time now.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, would you mind, Scott? This is kind of a big overarching question, but
Sure.
would you mind just briefly summarizing your interests and your journey and the things that sort of you self-educated on? Because people will not, and I resisted adding that into your bio because I want people to hear from you, but it's incredible the things that this path that you've put yourself on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you think so. I've been writing for, as you mentioned, for just a bit over 14 years. And for the last decade of that, I've been focused a lot on kind of taking on what I'd call kind of unorthodox self-education projects. So back in 2011 was when I did my first big project I called the MIT Challenge, which I wanted to learn MIT's four-year computer science undergraduate program. So learn the stuff that you would learn if you were an MIT student studying computer science. But instead of going to MIT and taking their classes and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in tuition, I used the free material from their classes they put online. And so I had the goal of trying to pass all the final exams and do the programming projects that an MIT student would do. But instead of doing it over 4 years and paying a lot of money, I did it over 12 months and paid about 2,000 bucks. I did another project with a friend. This was 2 years after, which we called the Year Without English, where we traveled to four different countries: Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea, to learn four different languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Korean. And the sort of crux of how we were doing that was, in each country, when we would land in the country, we would stop speaking English to each other or to anyone that we would meet, with the goal of trying to get as close to immersion as possible so that we could learn to interact with people, speak the language, converse. And I would say it was quite successful. We were able to get to at least a solid conversational level in each of those languages, particularly Spanish. I would say we did quite well with that. And we did these little mini documentary videos of the process. And I've also done other projects in things like portrait drawing, quantum mechanics, learning other languages, cognitive science, and various other things. And that kind of all culminated in publishing my book, which came out in August last year, Ultra Learning, which was not only sort of talking about my experiences taking on these kinds of projects, but really finding lots of really interesting, impressive people who have tackled similarly challenging learning projects and trying to dig deep into what are the principles behind learning something well that's difficult.
Yeah, that's amazing to me. I mean, first of all, congratulations
Oh,
on
thank you.
getting through an MIT four-year degree in a year. That's crazy. I think there were something like 33 different classes, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
33 classes. I did one of them sort of before it started as kind of my test class. So I did 32 in the sort of 12-month period. But
right,
yeah, it was an exciting year.
that's incredible. So that's about a class a full semester
A
class,
week and
about
a
one,
half, yeah.
yeah, every 10 days.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
That's incredible. And this was on computer science.
Yeah, so the way that the MIT undergraduate program works is that computer science and electrical engineering are kind of a shared faculty. So you end up learning more physics and electrical engineering than you would in other computer science programs. Additionally, MIT their sort of whole idea is that every graduate should have sort of a robust science education. So I also did chemistry and physics and biology, and
Right.
I wasn't able to get exams for humanities classes, so I ended up substituting them mostly for economics. So I also kind of did like an economics minor in that year-long program. I did about, I think it was about 4 or 5 economics classes as well.
I have to tell you now, my appreciation and admiration for those 4 years, here's what it's based on. I have an undergraduate degree in engineering from Purdue.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great.
Well, no, not wow. But it took me 4 years. But man, I couldn't imagine doing all that in 12 months. So,
well, I think one of the, and this has sort of been a thesis among many of my projects, is that a lot of us don't really investigate what is it we're trying to get out of what we're trying to learn.
right.
And so as a result, we kind of approach things in these cookie cutter formats when really you have a lot more options to sort of pick and choose what you want to get out of something. And so for the example with the MIT challenge, I had an incredible advantage over MIT students in that I was really streamlining it to, again, passing the final exams and doing the programming projects, which sounds like it's an enormous amount of work, but MIT is a little bit more theory heavy than other classes. So I think I only had programming projects for maybe, I think it was maybe 8 or 9 classes. And even then they were usually not like month-long, huge pieces of software, but like solving some particular kind of puzzle. And so the basic idea is that I could kind of cover the same amount of knowledge, but I didn't have to, wait weeks to get feedback on my assignments. And I didn't have to, well, I got a half an hour to kill before this lecture starts. I could just have complete control and autonomy over my schedule. And so that allowed me to get kind of what I wanted to get out of learning a computer science undergraduate degree, but in a sort of radically different format. And I would say the same thing with the language learning project as well, that if your goal is to be able to have simple conversations with people, not necessarily deliver university lectures, but to be able to chat with people, make friends, travel, all those kinds of things, you can often do that with a lot less time than is kind of sort of conventionally thought to, master a language, so to speak. And so I'm certainly not trying to diminish people who, get PhDs and they work full time for 4 years on their undergrad and that, that they were doing something wrong, or that someone who wants to spend 10 years learning a language is making a mistake, but rather that there's many different paths, there's many different ways you can acquire skills, and just to show some of the possibilities. So I try to do sort of weird projects that kind of have different constraints than normal, because everyone knows that you can do a degree in the normal way. This is sort of, I had never encountered anyone who had tried to do something like this before my project. And so I wanted to try to sort of show what might be possible if you were significantly dedicated and interested in trying something different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's really interesting is that aside from doing it and gaining all that knowledge and those skills, what's interesting is that you also showed yourself and you showed everyone that there's another path in the first place.
I think one of the things that I really try to advocate for in what I'm doing is that very often we do want to have specific competencies, and we sort of take this very general approach. We don't tailor to what we're actually after. And as a result, we spend a lot of time working on things that maybe don't matter that much for the outcome that we're trying to generate. And so I think this applies not only for the things that we get in our kind of formal university education, but lots of things that we learn on the job, lots of things that we learn in you buy books for something and you're learning it in a very generic way when what you're really trying to get is quite specific. And so I think this is really my message, I would say, is just that there's way more options, way more possibilities, way more kind of unconventional ways that you could go about acquiring skills than many people realize, and that the entire educational industry, the entire way of thinking about learning is often unnecessarily conformist. And I think that we'd be much better in a world where there's a lot more diversity in how people pursue skills, in how they, which things they optimize for, what they pursue, and being kind of aware of the trade-offs that creates, but at the same time, recognizing that, I knew a lot of people that they just didn't think that you could learn something well enough like you would in college. Like you just have to go back to school to learn it.
Right.
And so that was sort of one of the things I wanted to challenge. And I think not only my example, but many, many other people's examples show that if your goal was to be able to, live in Spain or live in China and be able to have, useful and profitable interactions with people and enjoy your life there and have friends and do that kind of thing. It's not the case that you need to spend 10 years studying it,
Right.
even though a lot of people would assert that. And so I think this sort of idea here is just, we all know the kind of classic examples. We all know the sort of, okay, the person who, did everything exactly according to the definition. But these sort of unconventional examples are often hidden from us. And so many people aren't even aware that that's an option, that you
Right.
can do it that way.
Scott, when you talked about, and I totally get it, you talked about how we go about something, education,
Mhm.
or learning a language or drawing or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's lots of general knowledge and information that we're studying. But the reality is, if we look at the outcome we want, there's very specific things that certainly apply more so than other things. And it reminded me of, which is true in nature, right? It's true in economics, which you said you basically have as a minor, the 80-20 rule, right? So if you just focus on, if you identify your outcome, and then if you focus on kind of the whatever percentage it is, 20% or whatever, that's going to get you 80% of the way there. That's probably a great way to start in terms of efficiency and efficacy and all those things.
Well, the way I like to phrase it in the book, and I think is a good way of thinking about it conceptually, because I do agree with you that there is definitely things that are going to be disproportionately helpful and more central to what you're trying to do. And so the 80-20 rule does apply. But one of the challenges of applying the 80-20 rule is that, for a lot of domains, you do actually need to know quite a bit of breadth in order to be able to perform in that situation. And so there can be, like, for instance, I've heard that for languages that, well, you only really need to know like there's only this like core 100 words and they show up, they're like 80% of the vocabulary. I don't know what the exact statistic is, but the problem is that to have many conversations, often the very specific content words are the things that make meaning for the sentence. Like words like the, and, is, like they're not really telling you what the conversation's about. They're in every conversation, but they're not that helpful as a result. And so the way that I like to focus on it, rather than trying to sit back from kind of an armchair perspective and say, okay, well, what are the really important things, is to just not even answer that question. And instead to ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get good at? And try to do practice that is as direct as possible, that is trying to emulate the thing that you're trying to get good at. And that will give you that feedback loop of what things you need to learn. So which words you need to learn in a language is very often determined of which words do you want to use, which words are coming up in situations. And this may even be very context specific. So when we were traveling, for instance, we were doing this little like mini documentaries. And so one of the first words that we learned in every single country was how to record something. Like record is not usually a typical beginner word. It's definitely not something you learn on the first day. It's definitely not something that you're like, okay, let's learn how to say the word record. But it was something that we had to learn. And at the same time, this sort of directness approach of figuring out, okay, well, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What is the sort of practice environment that I'm trying to get good at? And doing practice there and using that feedback is so important for guiding your progress. But at the same time, a lot of the ways that we've been conditioned to think about learning is to remove ourselves from the real situation, to spend a lot of time in a kind of artificial classroom environment, or just reading a bunch of books or doing research or preparation, with the idea that eventually we'll be able to do things in the real situation. And I don't want to say that always fails, but I think that there is substantial evidence that people underestimate or they overestimate rather the effectiveness of doing this kind of situationally detached form of learning. Like the kind of people who get apps for their phone to learn a language, but what they really want to do is what we're doing right now, which is have some kind of conversation. So why not practice some kind of conversation with someone? Why are you playing on your phone continuously without actually doing that? Or if you're trying to, write computer programs because you want to build your own games, why aren't you trying to make your own game? Why are you doing some other kind of exercise? And so I don't want to say that you never need instructions or help or books. I don't want to be misconstrued as making a more extreme point than I'm making, but rather that our entire kind of gestalt of what learning is so heavily based on this model of sitting in a classroom and listening to someone talk rather than going out and doing things, which is how we're actually designed to learn. I think that there's just a disconnect.
Yeah, which is a great lead-in for your 30 days of drawing, your portraiture drawing. And I'll put up here when this goes up, I'll put up your first little illustration or sketch, and then I'll put up what you did 30 days later. And it's amazing how someone could transform themselves in terms of their artistic abilities in just 30 days. And in contrast to the MIT challenge, in contrast to the year without English in 4 different countries, this is a motor skill. This is a visual motor skill. And I loved how you would learn to make these quick sketches and then overlay the actual photograph. So you were getting very quick feedback on really where the eyes were, where the nose was, what the mouth was like. Do it again and again and again and again, dozens of times a day or whatever.
So it's really funny because a lot of these things seem so superficially different, but when I think about what is the process for learning them, there's such deep kind of pattern similarities between them that for me, I don't really see them as being that different in terms of what I'm actually trying to do with them. But obviously, a lot of people, I think, they don't see them as having anything in common, like trying to learn a language or trying to, learn math, basically what I was doing in the MIT challenge, or trying to learn like artistic skills seem so different, but really they involve a lot of the same things of trying to identify a process, getting feedback, trying to, you have to improve your memory. You have to be able to remember how to do things. There's a lot of like similar sort of attributes there. And with the portrait drawing one, I think as well, like you mentioned an important kind of facet of that. My sort of initial approach to it was do tons and tons and tons and tons of portrait sketches. And then I would just take a picture of them and like put them on my computer and then use just sort of like, with basically Photoshop, I just put like a transparent version of the actual image. And then you can just see like, kind of like if you had tracing paper, like how well did I trace the image? Yeah. And that's really good, I think, up to a point. I think it works really well for just overall recognizing what kinds of mistakes you're making. There's a lot of sort of well-known biases in drawing people's faces that, like kids, for instance, like the classic smiley face. If you look at the classic smiley face, the eyes are about like the top third. Yeah. You look like an emoji. And that's sort of how we're kind of primed to think of faces, because my face is sort of the most important part of my head to look at. And so it grows kind of in our visual consciousness. Yeah. But in reality, if you actually look at a person's head, if they're not, if a normal person's head, it's going to be, the eyes are going to be about the middle. Yeah. And you can even see this if you're watching the video for us right now. Try to just like with your squinty eyes with a finger, just measure the difference between like the top of your head and your eyes and the eyes and your chin. It's about the same. Right. Varies from person to person, but it's about the same. And similarly, there's other like little kind of symmetries that we exaggerate. And so a lot of people, especially if they're drawing a head left to the side, for instance, they forget how much actual skull there is. And so they draw the face kind of going way over the back. And so I think getting this kind of feedback can correct some of those mistakes because you see what you have to do. But to go further, like, and this is one of the things that I found in a lot of these learning projects is that you find a method that gets you some mileage and then it starts to peter out. And then you have to be like, okay, what am I going to do now? Because I'm kind of tapering off my growth. Right. And so you have to find something else. So I actually spent some time, I just paused in the middle of the project to do more research. And I found this really great course taught in Chicago by an artist studio called Vitruvian Studio. And the guy, and you should see his portraits because they are like, they're better than pictures. And that's the thing that's weird. They're better than photographs. Like that's how good they are. But I realized from watching his lesson about how many little subtle other skills you need to get that increased accuracy. So he has a whole method of basically it's a little bit tedious, so you can't do it for quick sketches, but it basically involves sort of triangulating where something is and it allows you to get kind of arbitrary precision. So one of the very common methods that people use to draw when they're not very good at drawing is what is called a grid drawing, where basically you put a grid on your piece of paper and you put a grid over the image you're trying to draw. Then you just copy the little squares, right? And then that keeps like overall proportion relationships, because if you're drawing like a person's face, well, their eye is in like B3. You can't put it on the wrong square. But that also is limited to the resolution of your grid. So if you imagine your grid only having 4 squares, you have less precision than if you have 1,000 squares, but then 1,000 squares becomes really tedious to like count and draw and do all that kind of thing. Whereas this triangulation approach, it kind of lets you get arbitrarily precise. So you can figure out, oh, no, the pupil actually is like 0.5 millimeter over this way. And that's the kind of thing you can't do in a grid method.
Right.
You can do with this method. And even just things like how like lighting affects objects and like reflected light, even just having a theory of, how optics works gives you a sense of like, well, this has to be darker than this for this reason, even if you can't see a contrast. So you have to make the contrast in the image. So there's lots of these little kind of theoretical ideas that become instruments for practice. And so you get feedback. And so there's a subtle idea. I don't want to give the impression that there's just something mechanical you do over and over again to get good at these things. It's really a process of being, my learning progress is slowing right now. What is the sort of the next kind of refinement, next technique to get there? And so there's a lot of times where there's this interplay between reading about methods and then going and applying them directly. So even if you're talking about learning a language, it's not just about doing practice for grammar just for that sake, but I need to be able to express these kinds of thoughts. And so what are the rules for being able to do that, and then going in and learning those as well,
Well, it's interesting. I quite like the artist Chuck Close. And if you look at some of his early work, he had a vascular collapse, which caused paralysis, and his work has changed. But if you look at which is still amazing and incredible and creative, but if you look at some of his earlier work, his pencil drawings, they are virtually indistinguishable from photographs.
Well, that's also one aspect of art too. Like I think, one of the things, again, to kind of circle back to this theme of greater variety, there is a sort of tendency to constrain our judgment onto a few particular benchmarks. So we were talking about, a lot of things that people who are new to art would judge a picture on is how faithful it is, because that's obviously a skill that a lot of people don't have, to draw very faithful drawings. And particularly with portraiture, it's a super important thing. If it doesn't have a resemblance, then it's a bad painting, kind of almost by definition. But the idea is that there's all these other dimensions of what makes, the reason Van Gogh was a really good artist wasn't that he was a really good draftsman. He was actually a terrible draftsman. His paintings, for the status of someone who is a professional artist, are not very good in terms of trying to represent what he was drawing, but they have so much more. Like you look at a Van Gogh painting and it's beautiful. It's clearly an amazing work of art. And so I think, to extend this point, because we're getting into art maybe a little bit too much for people who aren't interested in portraiture, the idea here is that every skill that you might want to learn, every subject that you might want to master, just has so many different dimensions of expressive potential. So that if you want to be a leader or a manager or a programmer or a public speaker or any of these kinds of skills that you want to develop, it's not the case that there's just a single benchmark that you're just trying to statically get better on, but you're exploring different possibilities. You're exploring different things to work on and optimize and get better at. And that, so in many ways, learning and creativity and self-expression are linked. And this is even true for something like chess. I was researching chess players, and this is something that you'd think is like, well, this is the most like, well, there's just one standard. You have to beat other people at chess. There's nothing else. But as you get to the higher levels, you'll see players that they really focus on opening preparation, or they really focus on a certain style of play, or they focus on, so even then they're making choices about, this is what I'm going to focus on getting really good at, or this is where I want to express sort of my ideas or my strengths. And so this idea of a very conformist, everyone goes through the same funnel, everyone does exactly the same thing, learns the same things, gets valued on the same benchmarks. It makes sense for credentials, but I don't think it makes sense for self-education or for the kinds of things that we often want to learn to do well in our careers or to do well in our lives.
Right.